Alright, y'all, so today I wanted to do a very quick book review of the book Ready Player One, which was released all the way back in 2011. Its author's Ernest Cline. It was famously adapted into a movie directed by Steven Spielberg, and it was obviously a pretty huge deal when it came out, and still a lot of people talk about it to this day. The reason why I'm doing this book review, and typical I don't really do book reviews, but that I seen the movie, obviously, like that typical phrase goes, I seen the movie and I kind of wanted to compare it to the movie and see how different the original book was. In most cases, the book is usually better than the movie just because of the nature of the art form itself. You can be a lot more descriptive, you can go into a lot more of the characters' motivations and actions. In a movie, there's just a very limited amount of space and time to really tell your story. So I think to kind of give you my brief opinion of the book, and also I might, like I said, slightly compare this book and the movie quite a bit in this review. I will say that the book overall is pretty decent. I didn't walk out hating the experience, but in terms of my comparisons of the movie, I'm a bit mixed on that aspect because the movie does some things remarkably better and like adds a lot of things to the story that I think needed to be there in the original. And there's a lot of things in this original story I wish made it into the movie. So it's kind of, they both got their pros and cons, and they're really just two entirely different things. I would describe the movie as a pretty loose adaptation of the book. I think overall it's a pretty decent book. I enjoyed it, but I do think there's a lot of issues with it, and I'll definitely get into them in my review. But I think overall it's a pretty solid, decent book. I wouldn't call it great. I wouldn't call it an amazing piece of literature. And a lot of criticisms have been thrown at over the years, and I've seen a lot of reviews saying it was terrible. I totally get it. But I do think overall it's a decent adventure science fiction kind of book. To kind of give you a very, very brief synopsis of the book, at least, it revolves around this game called the Oasis, and it's set in the future of 2044 or 2045. And basically, the real world is a dystopia. There's famine, there's wars. It's a completely nightmarish, hellish place to kind of live in. And everyone basically tries to escape the reality in this hugely popular VR MMO kind of game called the Oasis. The creator of this game left a Easter egg that basically, if one of the players got this Easter egg, they would basically control the Oasis and get the shares of the company that made the game, basically making them super rich. In order to get the Easter egg, so to speak, players would have to find 3 keys that would open 3 gates, and as a result, they would basically get the Easter egg. Basically, the main character of this story is called Wade. His Oasis character name is Parzival, and it's kind of narrated from like a sort of like future tense where like Wade's already won the contest, but he's like narrating the events of how he won the Easter egg, so to speak. And he basically used a combination of clues and basically gets all 3 keys. He works with multiple different characters called H, Artemis, Shoto, Daito, so to speak. And eventually, by the end, gets the Easter egg against an evil corporation called IOI, which is led by an evil man called Sorrento. In the Oasis, their avatars are known as Sixters. Also, I forgot to mention the main characters and most of the people that are searching for the egg in this massively huge contest are called Gunters. I know that's a very, very brief description, but I'm just kind of really just going through the basics here. But yeah, I'm going to kind of jump into the pros and get into my opinions of the book. I will say there's a lot of things, and like I said before, I know I'm going to draw a lot of comparisons to the movie, but I do like, in terms of one of the pros of this book, is I do like the contest itself and the challenges themselves. There's also a lot of small details in the book that I kind of wish they put in the movie. For example, Halliday, it's mentioned that when he created this contest for the Easter egg, he kind of admitted it might be broken and he didn't have any time to beta test it. And there's a lot of extremely difficult and niche challenges in this book that characters have to go through to get the keys and open up the gates and get the riddles and such. And, it seems kind of broken, like a lot of video games that have no balancing seem to be. And I really enjoy that aspect of the book. One thing about the movie I did criticize is that there's a lot of things, like some of the challenges in the movie seem super simple and kind of shocking. It took 5 years for someone to find that out. For example, in the movie, It's a big car chase, and you basically have to reach the end of it and kind of escape this massive King Kong like creature, if you will. He's basically King Kong, but you have to escape Kong and reach the finish line, so to speak, and no player's been able to do that. Parzival was able to do in the movie because he basically figures out that, oh, you got to go backwards in the track. Realistically, someone would have figured that out pretty quickly, right? In the movie, or excuse me, not the movie, in the book, it's a lot more intricate, the challenges, and I really enjoy that. I also really like the fact, like I said before, how a lot of these clues are found. Like, for example, the first challenge that basically is resulting as Wade getting the copper key, basically a little bit of a coincidence, but he goes on this school planet, which, yes, Wade goes to school in the Oasis and everything that was not in the movie, but basically he finds out through these like little indents in this book called the Anorak's Almanac, which in the movie it's called, I think, Halliday's Journals, which is like this huge visual library of Halliday's life recreated in the Oasis. So like giving you a visual interpretation. In the book, it's literally a journal, right? Anorak released sort of an almanac that was a combination of his entire life and his experiences and notes and bunch of observations that Halliday, the creator of the Oasis, made. Wade basically figures it out in a Latin class in his Oasis school on his school planet called Lotus, that there's like these little small dents in the page, and that basically all leads to a secret Dungeons and Dragons style cave that results in him basically playing a game against a Lich King, if you will, kind of an undead, possessed king, if you will, but playing an ancient 80s arcade game called Joust to get the key. So like I said, quite different. A lot more of the challenges in the book are very much intricate and detailed, and albeit broken, and it feels more realistic, at least in the book for the most part, in terms of the difficulty of the challenges. Because there's a lot of things in this book that, in terms of how characters figure out things, are pretty obscure. And the clues that actually get those items and such are pretty, like I said, they make more sense, they're harder, and I appreciate the fact that in the book it feels a lot more realistic that in 5 years no one would have figured this out. So yeah, I really like the twist, especially the first challenge, like I said, which is literally found on a school planet no one thought of. That was pretty cool. I also like a lot of the scenarios in this book as well, and some of the challenges. I like the first challenge where Wade has to play against the Lich King in that arcade game called Joust, so to speak, kind of an old 80s arcade cabinet game, if you will. And there's a lot of 80s and pop culture references throughout this book, which is one of the reasons why it's quite famous. I'm a bit mixed on the pop culture references, and also I think I'm a little bit blessed because there's just a lot of references in this book, compared to the movie at least, I never really got. So a lot of people that got mad about the pop culture references, my ignorance kind of helped me, at least in that aspect. Like, a lot of the arcade games in this book and the 80s style and approach that this book has, very much different from the movie. I think the ignorance really saved me there. Like, I didn't even know what Joust was before I read this book. But yeah, I like how complex the challenges are throughout the book. I will say that it does get a bit repetitive by the time that the third challenge rolls around, which is literally another recreation of a movie that a character has to recite lines of dialogue as if they're the main character, and basically just have to have the movie memorized from heart. By heart, so to speak. The first gate, if you will, in the book that Wade has to go through, because basically you have to get a key, you get a clue, you got to go to that gate, basically with that key to unlock that gate. You do the challenge inside the gate, and then you get another riddle for that next key. The first of these is War Games. Wade has to go through basically playing as Matthew Broderick's character in that movie, which I think was decent. It just feels kind of out of nowhere. And then the last part, which is the Monty Python and the Holy Grail recreation, which I thought admittedly was pretty funny that they included that at the end of the book, but some of the issues with the challenges I think got a little bit repetitive by the end. But yeah, I like how much more difficult the challenges are. Also, the fact that there's just a lot more description and world building in this book. And I know that a lot of people are going to say there's just a lot of exposition dumping, like the movie. But I feel like the nature of the story really needs to have that, just because you're talking about a massive MMO game called the Oasis. There's tons of characters, world building. This is in the future. I think I will allow exposition building, at least in this case, from the movie and the book. But one thing is the nature of the book itself. I really like how really detailed and explained a lot of this world is. They go into really a good amount of depth, a lot more than the movie, in terms of explaining the Oasis to people, how there's tons of universes and worlds and avatars, how people can create avatars, how people can, if you get killed in the Oasis, you will lose all of your guns and weapons and gear, which I'll kind of get into more of my criticisms. But, I like how really explained everything is. I also like how they kind of go into the locations of everything, how there's this concept of zones, how there's non-magical zones, how there's technology zones, how there's magical zones. And inside, basically all these zones kind of comprise of planets and sectors, and there's like multiple sectors, and, kind of traveling across this massive universe called in the Oasis will literally take days and hours. I like how just detailed and explained a lot of the world building is, which is pretty cool. I also found that Wade, while especially in the later half of the book, I have more problems with his personality. But at the beginning, I like how sympathetic his story is. You get also a lot more detailed backstory into the life of Wade in this book. You find out how really depressing his life was, how his mom OD'd on drugs, how his dad got killed in a hunger riot, and he lives with his aunt who basically steals his laptop once she finds him in the trailer that he lives in. It's much more harsher than is shown in the movie, and you really sympathize, at least for a good majority of the book, with Wade, which I really enjoy. I also like the romance between Artemis and Wade still in this book. I think it's pretty good. Now, I think there's certain aspects of the romance that I feel border on obsession and stalking, at least especially from Wade's side of things. But I did enjoy the romance part about it, and I thought that their blossoming relationship before Artemis shuts them down is pretty cool. And the whole scene that happens with her confronting him at the dance club as Parzival and stuff, that is pretty damn similar to the movie, surprisingly. They basically rip out lines from the book. So that's pretty cool, and I like certain aspects of it. There's certain things about the club, too, that are also really similar to the movie. I kind of wish they would have included more of Ogden Morrow's character, but the twist in the movie, I actually think, works a little bit better. Like, I like the fact that Ogden Morrow in the movie gives him the quarter, just because it feels a little bit more natural. While in the book, Ogden Morrow spies on them and eventually helps them out at the end by giving them a stable place to stay and fight in the Oasis. I also like certain aspects, too, of the book in terms of its references and the battle itself. I also like the final battle, which is kind of different from the movie. Sorrento still uses a giant Mecha Godzilla here, but one of the big things is that after the characters, clear the second gate in the book, they all get a choice of robots that they can basically choose and basically become in the need that need to become a giant controller, basically a giant mechanical robot. And a lot of the references to these robots are very quite obscure. I had to look up a lot of these, but a lot of them reference 70s and 80s anime. But it was really cool, like having Wade control the Spider-Man, the Japanese Spider-Man Megazord robot thing was really, really cool. And I like the big battle that happens. H also controls a Gundam, if I'm not mistaken. And, Shoto and Artemis also control different but giant robots from anime. But that was all really cool stuff, and I like how it was portrayed here. I also like the fact that there's some real big stakes in how the villains of the story are portrayed. The Sixers here are completely unlikable, just like the movie. The Sixers attempt to kill and bribe Wade here, and they also blow up his aunt's trailer, killing tons of innocent people. They also, try to blackmail people. They also make plans to kill all the other people in the scoreboard and try to, find, private information. And I feel like, personally speaking, they're a lot more villainous in the book than how they're portrayed in the movie in a weird way, which is pretty cool. So they really did a good job of establishing the Sixers as really big villains in this story. And I really just enjoyed how evil Sorrento was. He was a really big bastard in this book, and it definitely lets you, sympathize with Wade, even though he was pretty creepy in certain aspects in his struggle to win and capture the Easter egg. I also like how, like I said, certain challenges are. I like the final battle. I like the villains. I like how detailed and descriptive a lot of these things are. I like some of the writing, the dialogue between H and Parzival. Still very likable, just like in the movie. And I think, too, there's just a lot of really cool things. And this book is also very much more skewed towards the 80s. You can really feel like Ernest Cline was very much born in the 80s, always grew up in the 80s, and just wanted to kind of throw this book through a huge 80s nostalgia wave, if you will, which I think is a good and bad thing in this book, just because from a little bit of a biased perspective, because I did not grow up in the 80s. I have some nostalgia, I guess. There's some things from the 80s I enjoy, but, there's certain weird things. I also like how certain worlds and universes are portrayed here. There's a really cool moment where, like, Parzival lands on this giant arcade planet, which is, like I said, not in the book, not in the movie, and how it's described and how, it's very much 2D and sprite-based and pixel-based. That was a really cool little visual design language. And I like a lot of the descriptions and areas and stuff. It's a very well described in terms of the world building and how everything looks, which is pretty cool. Also, the differences in terms of how all the characters look. And one of the big differences, too, is that one of the main characters from the movie, which did survive while in the... actually, I think he did die in the movie. I just can't remember. But he dies in a completely different way, which is Daito. Which in the book, he gets killed by Sixers. If I remember correctly, he becomes a Gundam, and then he kind of sacrifices himself and eventually gets killed. I do kind of like how the movie did it a little bit, but in the book, it's presented as a very brutal way of showing how the Sixers are extremely evil. And I do also kind of appreciate how it's also portrayed in the book. So I think how it's done there and how really just the conflict with the main characters and the villains is done very well here. And I also like the general quest adventure kind of style of narrative that's being told here. This, like I said, is both positives I will say about the movie and the book. I just like the story and the idea of this kind of egg hunt, if you will. Characters finding all these lost clues, going on this giant adventure across a giant video game that has tons of references and characters. Maybe it's a little kid in me that sees this, but I honestly think this is all pretty cool stuff. Now I'm going to kind of get into some of my cons. Now, there's a lot of big things, and I will obviously make some comparisons to the movie here. But one of the big things that I have some issues with is the obscurity of the 80s stuff in this book. One thing I do like in the movie is that there at least tends to be more modern day pop culture references. So like they show Halo and Overwatch in the movie, and there's also other bigger and more modern things. In the book, it's not really the case. Characters are playing tons of arcade cabinets, and 80s and old 70s media is always being constantly examined. Now, it's explained that, Halliday had a big obsession with the 80s. He was sharing it in the world. He put in everything he designed. It's kind of funny how it's portrayed in the book because it's like this weird obsession with 80s only started with Halliday's contest, which is true. I don't think there's a huge obsession with the 80s as much, unless there's a reason to be. And, I do think it makes some sense in the story. They do explain it, but I just have some issues with some of the obscurity of the challenges. And one thing I really like how the movie does is that each challenge, each time the characters are trying to find, in the movie, the key to the contest, it reveals some backstory and hidden layer to Halliday and explains certain things about the contest. He kind of interweaved his personality a little bit. In the book, that's not really quite the case. There's certain aspects and certain challenges that are definitely interpreted by that, and there's also a big scene with Halliday at the end of the book, but there's not really that deeper level of sophistication and look at the character here, which is kind of one of my little criticisms, is that the obscurity of some of the 80s references. I didn't really get a lot of them. The first challenge is Joust. I never heard of it, so it didn't really do anything for me. The movie War Games, which was the first Gate, I've seen it, but it's not really an insanely popular 80s movie, in my opinion. There's also, like I said, other games, like the last game I think Parzival plays that he has to get a higher score than Halliday, I think was called, it's kind of escaping my brain. Tempest, I think. Could be misquoting that, but it was like an old 1980s Atari game. I had literally never heard of this. And it's kind of like goes throughout the entire book, and it kind of, I don't know, it's a little bit of an ignorant thing, I guess, but some of the 80s pop culture references kind of flew over my head. And I think the fact that it didn't fall over my head, the reaction from some of the characters and how they're described in the book with such joy kind of eludes me because I didn't grow up in the 80s. And I feel like there need to be a little bit more modern day pop culture references. I definitely felt like I said, it's explained in the story, but I don't think that doesn't really, exclude the opportunity to include more modern day video game references that I think more millennial readers or Gen Z or whatever readers that read this book will get. Like there could have been a totally, a section of the, like one of the black gates, not the black gates, one of the gates and the challenges could have been like, I don't know, they jump into Halo Combat Evolved at some point. I think that was a little bit of a missed opportunity. Some of the obscurity of the 80s references and them constantly playing arcade cabinets throughout this entire game. I can totally see, not the game, book, I can totally see why that was changed for the movie. So I will say the challenges I think are more visually interesting and more dynamic in the movie. But one thing that, like I said, all these challenges have going for them is the difficulty level. Some of the difficulty is absolutely insane. Then also there's another big issue with the book, which I did mention a little bit of a while ago, but it's a little bit of Wade. Wade is kind of a very much egotistical, obsessive character throughout the book, and especially when he breaks up, when Artemis breaks up with her and dumps him, he really doesn't take it well. Like he actually sends like constant messages to her, drops things at her stronghold. It's just constantly trying to get in contact with her. And a weird reference to, what's that one movie from the 80s? It's the In Your Eyes song from Peter Gabriel. And it's that one character, John Cusack's character, that's holding the boombox over, the lawn of this girl that he really likes and he's trying to get back. And he does that here, but it seems very sad and pathetic. Wade is just a very much of a mixed bag of a character here. He comes off as very egotistical. He really knows it all. There's certain things, too, about him that in terms of, like, working with others that I think the movie does better, because in the movie it feels like Wade really is more likable, more honest. He also works more with people. In the book, it's like, he's constant competition kind of with his friends, and then he's kind of giving God-level powers and does all these crazy, incredible things, which feel a little hard to believe. Like, he even infiltrates the Sixers to kind of give information about, the big bubble they put around Castle Anorak when IOI was trying to figure out how to open up the third gate. And he goes in like a straight Chad, like completely, hacks into their system, steals all their data, and then just walks out with all his fines from his endurement process completely paid off. And it just seems a bit OP, a little bit of a character that is kind of given too much God-level abilities. They also kind of go too much into detail with Wade's, downfall, I guess, after Artemis's breakup. He buys, like, a sex doll. He wears no clothes, literally just the Oasis suit in his blacked-out apartment. It just gets really creepy, and it kind of creates a very much drastic turn in terms of the quality and the likability of the character. So I feel like Wade is much more likable in the movie overall. In the book, he's a little bit of an egotistical, kid, teenager, virgin, I guess. There's a lot of weird references to sexuality in this book. So I don't really I think Wade is decent, but I think he comes off as kind of unlikable by the end, which is in contrast to the movie. I also think, too, some of the racist stereotypes here are a little bit absurd. Like the fact that there's these two characters, Daito and Shoto, which are two characters that also made it to the movie. There's like these characters, these avatars that basically are players from Japan. In the book, they take these very much, samurai approach to them. They are constantly bowing, constantly, giving items and swords and have honor. And it came off as very much like, I don't think kids or even young adults in Japan act like this. It felt very much like a racist stereotype, and I didn't really appreciate that. That's not really in the movie as much, so I think that's also a pro the movie has going for it. But in the book, it's really hyped up. Like, they are constantly bowing throughout the entire story, and it kind of drove me nuts personally. So yeah, the kind of mixed bag of a character of Wade, some of the racist stereotypes I also really didn't appreciate, and the obsessive stalker nature. Even though I do think the book kind of subconsciously knows that like what Wade is doing is bad because none of his actions actually get the girl. It's only when he works with others, gets the egg by the end, and he actually reunites with Artemis, and they actually have a very nice touching scene at the end, which is pretty interesting and pretty cool. I also think I have some issues with the Oasis here in general. Now, they're not really huge issues because I don't think they're really touched upon in the movie as much as they are in the book. But I feel like the Oasis, at least in modern day gaming terms and reviews, would be hated if it first came out. Because it's described in the book, characters can do certain quests and levels, but most of the game is microtransactions. And basically, if you don't know what that means, you got to use real money to buy real, like a virtual item, loot, if you will, to get a higher chance and basically abilities against players. And this is really a hugely despised game mechanic if you don't know anything about video games. It's sadly a very prevalent one. I mean, you have games like Fortnite where, there's tons of microtransactions. You got to buy V-Bucks to get skins. You also have tons of other things like getting weapons and loot. And while, like I said, it's not really a glaring issue in the movie, in the book it feels pretty much like it is. Now, I do like how grounded Wade's character is, how basically in the beginning he's stuck on this school planet, and Woodbury is a very much level 1 to 3 avatar, and it only has these very dingy sword and shield and stuff. But I think the microtransactions part of it was pretty off-putting to me, at least in terms of the appeal of this massive popular futuristic game. I didn't appreciate that. I think what they should have, like I said before, how the Oasis, in my opinion, should have been explained is that there would have been most of the items in the game are achievable in the game in terms of progress, loot, quest, which, to a certain degree they are, right? I mean, Wade, Shoto, and Daito go on this really cool quest, and they get this beta capsule that basically turns one of their avatars into Ultraman for a few minutes and such, which is really cool. I also like in terms of the escalation of the Gunters and the Sixers throughout the story here. Like, the Gunters are just going all out in terms of their war. While in the movie, it kind of feels a bit abrupt and sudden that all these avatars would show up across the entire, Oasis to fight against IOI and the Sixers. While in the book, it feels much more, gradual and makes sense. Like, there's a big battle on the second world where the second key is located with the game Zork, which is really cool and interesting. There's also a really cool sequence where Daito kind of, in the process becomes Ultraman, kind of kills a bunch of the Sixers, and then ultimately in real life gets killed, which is a really cool scene in the book. But back to my main topics. I think the microtransactions part about it is really off-putting to me. I am quite surprised the game would be as popular as it is, but it has so much microtransactions. It could be a thing where the world itself is just so shitty that people are willing to spend real money and work in the Oasis and such. I guess that could be explained, but I don't know. Like I said, it's a little bit of a context issue because at the time I'm making this review and the general discourse around video games, microtransactions are constantly looked down upon. So, yeah. And another big issue, and this was also appearing in the movie as well, the fact that your character, if he gets killed in the Oasis, it's completely game over. You're, in-game with real money, bought items, your whole entire inventory is completely wiped. It reminds me of a game called DayZ, where it was like a zombie game, and literally if you die, it's game over. And I don't find many of those games appealing for obvious reasons. Why would I play a game where if instantly some, asshole has a lucky shot on me, kills my avatar, I have to completely restart? I don't see how a game this popular would pick up so quickly in a game where the rules are so strict and crazy that your avatar, if he gets killed once, dies, you lose all of your shit. Especially, like I said, a game that's full of huge microtransactions. It feels kind of absurd, that notion of it. I think this issue really could have been circumvented in a lot of ways. For example, there could have been maybe a lives system, like characters could have had lives, or there could have been, like I said in the book, they use zones, right? They could have easily explained, oh, in certain gates and zones and challenges, your character can die. But in the normal Oasis, if you get killed, you maybe like lose a bit of points or experience or something like that. Like you lose tokens or credits, if you will. I think they're called credits in the Oasis. That makes a lot more sense. And I think the appeal of such a game would, be massively more popular, because I find it absurd that people, like I said, so many people are obsessed with this game, and if you die, you lose all your shit. That concept, especially to a lot of gamers, wouldn't be appealing. But like I said, this could have easily been circumvented where, certain zones or where characters are in the Oasis challenges themselves, like getting the keys or they're inside the gate. Those could have been zones where characters could have died. That could have at least, I think, in my opinion, plausibly in terms of world building, made a lot more sense. But yeah, that's another big issue. I also don't like the fact, like I said, this kind of adds upon the microtransactions aspect. But the idea that you have to have teleportation fees, money fees, ship fees, fuel fees, that kind of is also one of those little things about this game I don't really get with the Oasis. Why am I paying so much money to go to a different world and you're just stuck on this boring school planet, which is basically how Wade is at the beginning of the story. It's explained that he's so broke he can't, afford teleportation or transportation fares to go to different worlds or sectors, which I just find, like I said, hugely unappealing for a game that became so massively popular in the future. One of the biggest appeals of the Oasis is that there's so much worlds, there's so many universes. People would want to explore that. If you slap a bunch of microtransaction transportation fees across everywhere in the game, like you literally have to pay money to access anything in the Oasis, I find that concept really quite absurd, right? I feel like I said before, one of those things, this game I don't think would have been as popular as the book would have portrayed it as, and there would be a lot of negativity towards it. I think there could have been a system put in place where like characters could have teleported to different planets or sectors without the cost of teleportation fees. But like most games, there are just certain areas like DLC that are just blocked off and you have to pay to get into those worlds or universes. But there's a good amount of variety in at least basic worlds and sectors and zones you can go to completely for free. So yeah, that whole idea of teleportation fares and the whole microtransaction aspect of the Oasis, which, like I said, that aspect of it is not really touched upon that closely in the movie, so it's not really a huge issue there. In the book, it's touched upon a lot more, and it's one of the reasons why Wade in the beginning is just stuck on his school planet because he's so broke to go anywhere else. He's too broke to go anywhere else. That was another big issue with this book. Just some of the mechanics of the Oasis were pretty dumb, at least in my opinion. I also think some of the descriptions of characters and their avatars were pretty lame here. And I like how in the movie, a lot of the characters are given much more distinct and animated designs of their avatars. When I ever play a video game, whenever I create a new character or avatar, I always create something that looks maybe slightly like me, but something that looks really not like me overall, right? I create something more fantastical and different and just wild. I'm sure everyone plays games and creates avatars differently. And like I said, it's explained in the book. But for the main characters, Wade, his character in the book, his avatar Parzival looks exactly like him for the most part. There's some slight differences. There's some slight, body enhancements and such. But it's not really that much of a big difference. And H is the same way. Like, he literally... Now, H actually, granted, looks... The twist in the book that it's basically revealed that she was actually a, black girl, or black adult, excuse me. Black, young adult, so to speak. That's also in the book, which is pretty cool. In the movie, it feels a little bit more obvious in terms of that twist. But that one, I think, makes a lot more sense. But Artemis is another scenario like this. Her character looks pretty much exactly like her real-life counterpart, except she has armor and more, less of the birthmark and such. In the movie, it's much more animated. She's like pink, she looks more different, right? She looks similar but different. And like I said, the Asian stereotypes with them both wearing samurai armor, is a little bit of a mixed bag for me. In the movie, they kind of do a better job where like Daito's wearing samurai armor and Shoto's wearing his cool ninja outfit. So yeah, I think personally speaking, I like the movie in terms of their portrayals of the avatars more. It just felt very lame in the book. Like Wade just looks exactly like it. Now, granted, it's explained in the book because he doesn't have a lot of money, which goes into the bigger issue that the game is full of microtransactions to get anything solid. And I think it's one of the big flaws in terms of the portrayal of the Oasis here. I also think other characters are just kind of pointless. IROC, I think, is better portrayed in the movie. In the movie, he's kind of like a sort of side villain to Sorrento. While in the book, he's just very much annoying character that's just kind of a sort of begrudgingly allied to the main characters and just kind of rats out their location and disappears for the entire story. Has no purpose really too strongly in the book, while in the movie, I feel like he has a better purpose. So I think the movie also in terms of use of the characters, feels more purposeful and makes more sense, at least in the movie. But yeah, that's kind of my, overall opinion of this book. To kind of quickly wrap up, I kind of delved into some of my major flaws and positives about this book. It's still overall a pretty decent experience. I think it's a good read, but there are some pretty big issues. Some issues with the characters themselves, some issues with the story, and some issues with the pop culture references in terms of their modern day context, in terms of the age, in terms of the readers that were actually reading it. If you grew up in the 80s, you probably get a lot of these references. If you didn't, you might be a bit befuddled by certain references to, like I said, the plentiful of arcade cabinets that are mentioned in this. But overall, it's still a decent book. I didn't hate it. I enjoyed it for the most part. And I think that it's a decent read, if not flawed, but still a pretty fun, decent read. But yeah, it's my very quick review of Ready Player One, the book. Hopefully you have a good day and peace, y'all.